Ready to start the next section of Seminar 3. And this is the section on practice principles and processes. And of course it is much more practical, so we're shifting a bit here. And in particular today we're talking about self-distancing, personality functioning, and stages of change. Now, some of these things we're going to be looking at in more detail in future seminars, but we want to at least make some connections here. Self-distancing is made more real and possible by the distinction that we're making between the soul person and the brain and body. But self-distancing is a technique. In other words, it's a way to help us to utilize our soul person to change something in our brain and body. So it's a technique. Then the personality functioning, we're saying there are a number of things that are based in the brain. And we've been looking at in these first 3 seminars some of those: self-concept, self-efficacy, and even things like we aren't talking about today, but will be in personality functioning. That's different modes. Are all brain-based things that, as a soul person, we are much more able to make changes to by this real self-distancing that is there because of distinction between the material and the immaterial. And then we're going to talk about the practical stages of change. So that's going to be something to connect to the idea of the process of sanctification. Okay, so do you recall what the 3 primary life goals are? And we're about page 86 of this smaller book here. The things in life mentoring and life coaching that we call life goals, what those are. Let's talk about those for a minute. What's one of those life goals?
Strengthening the here and now. Relationship with God.
Yeah, strengthening the here and now relationship with God, so that the person remembers to include God in what they're doing in their daily lives, trusting that He is present with them. All right. Second, what's another life goal? And life goals meaning goals that would be helpful for anybody, in particular who's a Christian, but then we can adjust them a bit even for unbelievers or people who aren't regenerate. So what's another life goal? Pardon?
The growth in
character virtues?
Yes.
Yeah, so another life goal, which one is true for everybody, is to help them to grow in their character virtues. Now, we're saying that as those 2 are developed, then a third goal, life goal, is more naturally going to occur. And that third goal is
the resilience, right?
Yeah, that we would expect as the first 2 are increasing, it'll result in reaching another goal, which would be more resilience or more ability to sustain things that are challenges in life, to cope and manage them, and to actually flourish, even coming out of them. So those are the 3 life goals that we're talking about. And then we talk about in the material stages of change. And so what's the first stage in this process, and what does it entail?
story.
Telling a story?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what would be the second stage then?
Setting situational goals.
Yeah, and so telling a story starts first, then we get some understanding about what's going on, and it can be not necessarily the whole life, but even just in their past time between the meetings we've had with the person, more of the story, but situations have occurred. And then in the setting of goals, we always are working toward the life goals, but the situational goals are trying to help people in particular situations that are happening to them right now. that they would like to be able to handle better. And we're always going for non-psychological goals. We aren't trying to change some psychological process here. We're trying to address some specific thing that's happening in their lives that they want to see a resolution to, or to be able to manage better. And then the third stage is
Taking action, right?
is taking action. Yep. So something tangible is being done, something real, concrete, specific is being done to help reach a goal. So that goal related to something in their life story that's a situation, and then we're helping them to move forward. Great. Any thoughts about that process? Any thoughts about how it might connect with sanctification?
Well, it's interesting as people set goals, that as a life coach or mentor, a lot of times it's just basically kind of tweaking those goals, because they're going to be setting goals themselves as they're telling their story.
Yeah. And they might have even told us something that they already did in terms of action to try to fix it.
Right. So it's that resonance board that they need that doesn't push them in a direction that is not congruent with the goals that they're trying to set. Unless there's something really, they've got a really bad idea.
Yeah. And so I think what you're saying is whose goals are being set.
Right.
We want to make sure it's something that the person wants to accomplish, but we may actually have to influence that definition of what's the goal, if they are moving in a kind of negative direction or not quite have the goal clear enough. We may need to help them, but we might need to keep in mind that it's their goal and not our goal.
Right.
Yeah.
It's to be kind of a touchy deal when you're trying to help someone fix that goal, if it's an unhealthy goal or
Mhm.
not going to help them come to the place they are. To advise someone and to kind of point at them and tell them they're all wrong would be so offensive that they would not go that direction. It would help them.
You're trying to help them to recognize.
Just help them recognize what's helping, what's not. Yeah.
And sometimes that's by helping them to go logically to the next step in the sequence of events, to help them to see that the consequence of doing this will probably be this other thing.
Right, yeah.
So when I was working with kids years ago, and I was working and particularly with kids who were having difficulty with their judgment. They were having difficulty looking at the consequences of their actions. So one young man in particular, I remember, and this is when I was practicing in California, and the houses have wooden fences in the backyard between them, and that's a privacy fence, right? And so this one young man, we were talking about, because he was having real problems with making poor choices in his behavior. And so we're talking about, well, if you're in your backyard playing with a ball, and you kick it and it goes over the privacy fence, what do? I just jump over the fence and get it. I go, well, let's think about that. What if they have a dog in their backyard that doesn't like you? Oh, yeah, that's not good. What if the people are at home and they see you and they call the police? Oh, I hadn't thought about that. What would be another better alternative if your ball goes over the privacy fence? Finally, we get to the idea, I go knock on their door and I ask them if I can get my ball out of their backyard. Yeah, that's really a lot better. And so sometimes we'd even cut up, in the U.S. and newspapers, they have comic strips that have little boxes, and you read the first one, you probably do in other places, I just don't notice them as much. And we cut those up and we put them on a table and mix them up. And we say, now, I'd like you to put this in the right sequence. Some kids have a real difficult time getting it, because they have to figure out what's the last box, what's the first box, and what's the last box. And what boxes have to go in between in what sequence? So sometimes when we're even working with adults, we have to help them with their judgment. Let's think about what the outcome of that would be. And so, yeah, we can encourage them in a positive, toward a positive outcome. They'll be in a relationship that there'll be a peaceful resolution. It's probably not going to work well for you to go call them stupid. I mean, that's just not going to facilitate peace, right? But maybe if you go and talk about how you felt when that happened, there'll be a better outcome. So that's a better action. What kind of virtues would it take to do that? A certain amount of humility, a certain amount of courage. Those are the means, again, to do the action that reaches the goal. Maybe this is just repeating this over and over again, helping us to think about, okay, what is always the sequence of things? It's always a sequence of things. You learn, hear the story, set the goals, take action. It's always the case where there's to reach the goal and actually do those actions requires a certain amount of means to do that's in the character. A certain amount of humility, a certain amount of courage. It's the same pattern every time.
Right.
And when we hear stories, we can begin listening for, oh, I think that was a goal. They took that kind of action. And then that gives us kind of a sort of advanced standing in terms of what to do next. If they've tried several things and they haven't worked, probably not a good idea to keep trying the same thing over and over again, right?
Right.
So helping them to see, well, that hasn't worked 5 times, right? So let's think about some other kind of goal. Okay, so when we're doing that with people, we are already doing a certain kind of self-distancing. When I was talking to this young man, I might even have said to him, when you have a situation like that, you need to talk to yourself and do self-talk. And so, maybe even use your name. Johnny, your ball just went over the fence. You know what would happen if you jump over the fence. That would maybe get you in trouble. So you need to think about what's a better way. See, already that's a kind of self-distancing, isn't it? Self-talk. That's a very helpful thing for kids to give them a means to have better judgment about their behavior. But it can help us too. Yeah. So let's talk about self-distancing more specifically. Around page 192 in this book, the smaller one. Let's say 191. Yes, yeah, around 191, where it starts. I give him information about some research that was done by I believe, psychiatrist, I think at UCLA, when he was researching how to help people manage obsessive-compulsive disorder. And so this is one way of also thinking about how to help people more generally to self-distance. So let's talk about the steps that he originally used in his research to help people to stop doing some kind of ritual, like maybe washing the hands over and over again, or something that was being done compulsively. Or maybe even some kind of thought that was being done obsessively. Some people get stuck on the same thought. Sometimes they get stuck on certain numbers with obsessive compulsive disorder, and they have to do things in a certain number of times. The first one is relabel. To relabel deceptive brain message and uncomfortable sensations, call them what they really are. Now here, this is self-distancing. I'm going to relabel that. Okay? And so that if they see themselves doing like a compulsive behavior, I'm going to label that. That's a compulsive behavior. Right? But that's an obsessive thought. You see how they're already taking some I'm on a self-distance position by being able to do that. And then the second one is I'm going to reattribute it. I'm going to change, in other words, changing the perception of the importance of the thing that's happening. This is a brain message, because he's talking about, false brain messages, urges, thoughts, impulses. This sounding familiar? What does this sound like? Urges, impulses, thoughts.
Flesh, sinful nature?
It sounds a lot like what our bodies do that's called, spiritually, fleshly kinds of desires, right?
Right.
He will set me free from this body of death.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So what this is saying is he actually did this in his steps to say to oneself, it's not me, it's just my brain. Right? Because where is it really happening? Well, Schwartz knows that it is a brain dysfunction in obsessive compulsive disorder.
Right.
And if people stay stuck in the idea, I'm just this awful obsessive compulsive, then they're never going to be able to get out of it. But if they can say, wait a minute, I know that's a compulsive thought, a compulsive behavior. I know what that is. It's in my brain. It's not really me.
Right.
And then what's the next thing? To refocus, right? Directing your attention toward an activity or mental process that is wholesome and productive, even while the false and deceptive urges, thoughts, impulses, and sensations are present and bothering. What do you understand this to mean?
Distraction?
Kind of, isn't it? Kind of distraction.
No, it's not, right?
Yeah. But is it avoidance, really? It's not really just avoidance, I
Even
think.
when you said you're choosing
Something wholesome?
It's like a conscious turning away, turning towards something that is positive.
Yeah. Letting our minds dwell on the things above, letting something would say,
Set your mind down.
yeah.
But then is it also at the same time, you called the negative what it is, but you're kind of pushing it out by refocusing. You're taking positive to replace the negative.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
using your will to change that and to the true knowledge.
Yeah, an exercise of choice. To go toward what's true and right and good, all those things.
Yes.
If he's talking about compulsive, such a compulsive behavior, of course, he's talking about, specifically away from the hand-washing activity, let's say, and on to something positive or wholesome to do. To get the person to go maybe do some other activity instead. That's not a compulsive activity, but a positive thing. Go play with your children, or go take a walk, or whatever, something that's more positive. But we see it in that same dynamic, don't we, that is in the struggle that Christians have in life, of choosing those things which are focused on the spirit as opposed to the flesh, right? Yeah, so then the last one, reevaluate. Clearly see the thoughts, urges, and impulses for what they are. And this revaluing is, I think, important to keep in mind when we extend it to sanctification is what are those things really? They're simply sensations caused by deceptive brain messages that are not true and have little or no value. They are something to dismiss and not focus on. Okay, so what would that mean in terms of what we've been talking about sanctification-wise? Revalue. And this, in this sense, it means actually a kind of devaluing. If we're thinking about even more specifically sanctification.
Well, we have the Holy Spirit's help to change those thoughts. And through sanctification, the more we're able to do that, the more we grow, and the more we can help from the
Spirit.
Mhm. And that's the process. But if we're looking at, in particular, malfunctions,
Right.
like sin, how would we revalue that? Say there's sinful tendencies, even in our own lives, we'll say. How would we revalue the sin?
That we have been, the knowledge that we have been regenerated and that we are sanctified. That sin is something else, something
Mhm.
apart from what already God did in us.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's a kind of lowering of the power of the sinful disposition by affirming the reality of what's already been done. So a revaluing of sin, let's say more specifically, sinful behavior or sinful tendencies, is to say, wait a minute, those are inconsistent with who I really am.
Mhm.
And they're really just left over from the old person.
Mhm.
And I don't need to own that as being how I should live. Because I've already been set free from its power. You know what this is kind of a self-talk sort of thing.
Sure.
But do you ever know people who...
Strength.
Yeah. Do you remember situations where people, they have such an enlarged view of their own sin that it has this power over them. Because they have overinflated their badness, let's say, as opposed to revaluing it and saying, wait a minute, that's not who I really am. That's leftover stuff. It doesn't have to have that kind of power over me. I can make a choice with the Holy Spirit strengthening to choose a different direction.
I have a question. Using this reevaluating system, a friend of mine was mishandled as a child, and he has this obsessive thought process. It's in a loop that he has to deal with. If I continue to tell him that, is that going to be enough for someone that has been so damaged as a child? Or does it have to go more psychologically even to remove that loop of deceptive message in his brain, you know?
Yeah.
I'm sure that's a referral situation.
Right.
It is.
So that's something we always, of course, keep in mind in this process of when they're telling us their story, we're setting goals and taking action. If, for instance, you set a goal to do something different, but he keeps coming back to it
Right.
and not really able to change, it's one of the reasons we'd say there may be a need for, or one of the indications, there may be a need for a referral. Is there so much damage there psychologically that the normal process doesn't work?
Right.
Okay, so, a really, really damaged, psychologically damaged Christian,
Right.
or regenerate person or unregenerate person who's been really damaged psychologically, they're not an example of what's normal,
Of course not. Yeah.
right? And so when we read the scriptures and it talks about to make choices to manage the flesh and not let our bodies do certain things, the underlying assumption there is normal functioning, right? You can't tell that to an Alzheimer's patient, right? When they take their clothes off, don't stop taking your clothes off because their brain is so totally dysfunctional that they can't do that. So we don't try to impose, all the scriptural imperative on people who are too impaired to do the imperative. Does that make sense?
It's a bit of a judgment call to know, isn't it?
It is.
What's normal function? Normal function.
Yeah. So we have to watch for indicators, And like what I just mentioned is that we repeatedly try to help them and they just can't make any progress. That's an indicator. something else is going on. Does that satisfy your thoughts about how to, it's a gray area, right?
It is a gray area, and I know we said myself, there are some things that just come back and back and back. And oh man, am I normative or am I not? You know?
So that question, yeah, is where am I normative? and
Where
where am I normal?
normative? Is everybody else here normative?
Where am I normal and where am I not normal? Yeah. Well, that's being honest with ourselves, though, isn't it? I mean, we all have areas that we don't function as well in, right?
Sure.
And what do we do about that? Well, there's some areas that we can make progress in if we were not functioning as well as we'd want to. And then there's some limps that, like a person hurts their foot or leg and they limp. There's some limps we'll always have in life. So we were talking about there can be parts of us that are functioning really well, and there can be some aspects of our functioning that isn't. It's not an either-or kind of thing, but there are some folks that it's beyond just, some areas not functioning as well and others better, and they can compensate. Some people will actually need a referral to get deeper psychological help for things that are keeping them from moving forward in life. We have to look at evidence that indicates that, because it's not always something that'll be entirely clear. It'll take some time for us to figure out that, I think it needs some extra help on that one because they're not making much progress. And we can still work with them in some ways, but in other ways they'll need some maybe more professional psychological help. All right, let's see. We will touch briefly on the modes idea, and it's already kind of come up. But I want to say something about self-distancing as we're closing that part. If you're interested in this in more detail, we will be covering it in more detail, I think around Seminar 5. But to get advanced kind of reading, in the larger sized training and practice resources book, back in the end notes on page 180 to 185, I go into quite detailed explanation about self-distancing and reference professional material that's been written about that. So if you're curious and want to go into more depth now, that would be a place, and then we'll talk about it again in Seminar 5. So we today are talking about things like self-distancing and now modes, just to say that they are connected to this process of sanctification. And maybe you've experienced yourself being triggered by some kind of discussion with someone or some kind of interaction or something else that happens, and you realize that, wow, I think I responded a bit more like a child than an adult. I got overly angry or something, and I just don't usually do that, you know? Mm-hmm. That's the unevenness that I think we are talking about even before. Some areas that we're functioning more healthily in, and some areas not so healthy in. And in terms of modes and talking about that, let's see, I think page 196 in this. Not the training and practice, but resources, but the first book, The Relevance of Modes for Life and Mentoring. And we aren't treating the different psychological parts of the person directly, but we will experience people shifting in and out of them. And it might be one of those kind of things where we're meeting with them and go, whoa, I've never seen this kind of attitude in this person before, you know? I don't know where that's coming from. And usually it can be categorized as either like a dysfunctional parent attitude, dysfunctional child kind of attitude, are two of the basic ones, or a dysfunctional kind of coping mode. And maybe they'll say, well, yeah, I got some bad news at work and I went out and got drunk. And you go, you don't usually do that, do you? Mm-hmm. No, I don't. I don't know what happened, but it's really tough for me. And you realize that, okay, there are resources for getting through a suffering just weren't quite strong enough, and they resorted to something dysfunctional to try to cope with it, right?
Right.
But does this resonate with you all at all personally too? Where sometimes something will happen and maybe you'll feel scared like you were a child, or you'll want to really come down on somebody like your punitive parent. Or, does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and we'll see it in our clients too. And so we won't go toward the direction of uncovering what's behind that historically for them psychologically, but we can comment to them like, you know, you seem really different right now than I'm usually experiencing you. Almost as if you're a frightened child. It's what, so let's then think, we're not going to go into exploring childhood abuse with them and stuff like that, or parents that were overly punitive and abusive in some way. But we can help them make different choices for how they respond to that situation that might have triggered them to be more childish. And we do that by talking with them about it. They get this a sense of how we are responding to it. They're getting some self-distance from it, probably calming down a bit about it, and then we compare that with, well, what's really your deepest desire for how you want to handle this? Do you really want to go back and just yell at them like an angry child?
Yeah.
No, really, I'd like to resolve it. Okay, well, let's talk about some choices you can make coming out of that deeper kind of desire. And so we stay very situational here and now with it. We don't go psychological with it, but we do sometimes point it out and then see if they are able to come up with a different alternative to how to handle it. And like we talked about just a few minutes ago, if we find that they get into that mode and they can't get out of it, and they stay an angry child, let's say, or that's another indicator that this is something that probably is going to take some deeper or different psychological kind of work, because it's really a part of them that's so, I guess, not integrated with the rest of who they are and under their power to control psychologically that they're going to need some help. They fall into that pit, can't get out, so to speak, even with our help. Any questions or thoughts about that?
Well, I see how when we say how we perceive that as dysfunctional child or parent or whatever, but how do we approach saying, it looks like, maybe just come out right, it looks like this is something you're having trouble with all the time, and it looks like it's beyond my ability or our ability in our conversation to fix this. It looks like I really should look into getting some more deeper help. Was that be
Yeah, sort of
way
along, I think
about
sort of
it?
along that same line, yeah. I
Yeah.
would say it is. We were talking earlier about, being loving toward people by telling them things that maybe that they need to hear, but maybe nobody's ever commented to them about.
Right.
And this might be one of those things that maybe no one else has ever commented to them about, but that you've seen as a recurring pattern.
Right.
And maybe if you have several examples, it even helps more to say, this sounds like the same kind of thing that happened in these other situations, and it seems to not be changing.
Right.
And usually what that means is that some more intense work needs to be done to really get some resolution to that. And that's not the kind of thing that we're going to be able to do in mentoring or coaching, but it is the kind of thing you can get some professional help for. And we can keep meeting and keep working on the character strengthening things, even while you're doing that.
Right.
So, something along that line.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, I didn't spend more time on looking at, in the life mentoring worksheets, what they're looking at in terms of virtue development. But there's some material in the books that do that. Just to keep in mind that even in the life mentoring, which you're using worksheets, there are virtues being worked on, like an unmanageableness or the powerlessness worksheets. Very much it's challenging in a structured way for them to be honest, for instance, to be willing to admit things. So yeah, right. So that page is, and which page is that in this book? 200. Yeah, would be a reference for you to go back to. But just as a reminder that those things are always operating. Well, let's take a break, and we'll come back to our final section in a few minutes.